New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be exploring the life and work of the Austrian mystic Rudolf Steiner. With me is Gary Lachman. Gary is the author of a wonderful book about Rudolf Steiner called An Introduction to His Life and Work. Gary, incidentally, is an American living in London, and he is the author of nearly 20 other books, all dealing with subjects of great fascination to me, esoteric culture. And I expect to be doing many more interviews with him. This is our first interview. We did it via Skype, and I am now going to switch over to the Skype video. Welcome, Gary. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I look forward to this being the first of quite a number of interviews we can do together, because you've really created a considerable volume of work and research regarding esoteric traditions, and I think Rudolf Steiner is a very good person to start with. And your book, you make a point of noting that while Steiner seems to be quite a creative genius in the mystical arena, he got, you might say, a late start in life.
Mm-hmm. It's true. Well, thank you for having me on the show, and it's a pleasure and an honor to be here. But yeah, Steiner, well, he got a late start as Rudolf Steiner, sort of the esoteric teacher. Mm-hmm. He didn't start doing that until around 40. So in a way, he kind of exemplifies this idea of the midlife crisis, and he actually does exemplify. There's a theory of something called the creative illness that you go through at a certain midlife, and then you go through this psychological change. You emerge, characters like Jung and Steiner and Swedenborg with the whole kind of teaching and all that. But prior to becoming known as esoteric or a spiritual scientist, as he called himself, he was a Goethe scholar. He was a German philosopher. He edited literary magazines in Berlin and Vienna, not very successfully, but something he did. And at one point, just before he sort of began his career as an esoteric teacher, he was lecturing to just about anyone on just about anything in Germany, because he was one of these fantastic polymaths of the old kind of Central European school.
Well, it seemed to me as I was reading through your fascinating biography that he was notably unsuccessful in his early life. It looked like his career might amount to nothing.
Well, he had some early success in the sense that he was, as a young man in his 20s, he was offered the job of editing the scientific writing of the German poet and dramatist, novelist Goethe, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe.
Probably the greatest literary figure in all of German history.
Yeah, he would be sort of like Germany's Shakespeare or Italy's Dante. I mean, he's up there in the top A-list. He's never really translated that well into English. People know who he is, and we know about Faust, but we don't really I'm aware of why Goethe is as important as he is. But among many other things, he was one of these polymath, one of these Renaissance figures. I said he was a poet, dramatist, novelist, but he was also a scientist. He wrote about geology. He wrote about anatomy. He was an early evolutionist before Darwin, but he also wrote a great deal about botany and plant metamorphosis and things of this sort. And Goethe thought this was pretty much his most important work. It was all the scientific work that he did. But he was one of the few who had that opinion. The literary figures of the time thought it was this kind of, excusable excess in the great master. And the scientists, they forgave him for it because he was Goethe, but they thought it was just sort of nonsense what he was writing. But Steiner, who loved Goethe, Faust was one of the great books of his early life that really moved him. He jumped at the chance. He was basically, a young man needing to make a name for himself. I mean, one of the reasons I wrote my biography of Steiner is that if you go to read anything about him, his life, it's usually written by devotees, and you get this picture of, from early on, he knew his mission and all that kind of thing, and where he was going, and everything was a step in that way. But actually, like everybody else, as you say, he sort of looked around and tried to find a place for himself, and this was a golden opportunity for him at that time. So he jumped at the chance. He went to Weimar, where Goethe's archive was, and he edited all of these scientific writings. Probably the most important one was what he called the Metamorphosis of Plants. Goethe writes about in his account of his journey to Italy in the 1800s. He writes about being in Palermo and going to the botanical gardens. And it was there that he discovered what he called the Urpflanze, and that's a fantastic German word that means sort of the primal plant.
A very important concept for
absolutely,
Steiner.
very important. Yeah. And this, absolutely. And this was something that it was neither physical nor just an idea. It was somewhere in between. It was some kind of reality that was perceived through the imagination, the trained imagination. And it was precisely this that struck Steiner. Because up until then, or since he was a child, Steiner had lots of what we would call psychic experiences. He tells a very famous story in one of his lectures that when he was a young boy, he was being educated by his father, and his father was sort of a station master on one of the early railways in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And Steiner had an idyllic childhood. He grew up in the first early years out in the midst of nature and all that. And he became fascinated with he was able to perceive nature spirits and things of that sort. But he also tells a story of how one day when he was in the station master's place there, he saw this woman walk into the room and say to him, you must help me now and later in life. And he didn't know who she was. And then she promptly walked into the stove and then just disappeared. It was a vision. It was a spirit of some kind. And he later found out that it turned out to be the sister of his father, who had committed suicide in town. And so I'm mentioning this to say that Steiner had a kind of many experiences of having these kinds of visions and this kind of inner world. And then when he came across Goethe writing about it in the scientific way, it made him understand, like, this is something that doesn't have to happen haphazard. It's something that can be trained, something we can learn how to do. And that was sort of in the background for him for the next 20 years. He didn't really talk about that so much. What he did do is he got these ideas across by writing several books about Goethe's view of the world. And if you know intellectual history at this time, this is sort of the late 19th century, Goethe's view of the world was not was no longer as popular or as important or anything like that. It was sort of the rise of scientific materialism and reductive sort of science. And it was precisely against that Steiner developed Goethe's ideas.
Goethe was what we would call a romantic.
Well, he's practically invented German Romanticism with his early novel called The Sorrows of Young Werther. And this supposedly triggered off a rash of suicides across the continent, because it's a story of unrequited love, and Werther is this very romantic, tragic, poetic figure who is always gushing, going off into these ecstatic states with nature and the clouds and the mountains and all this kind of thing. And for us, who we spend lots of money to go out of our way to go find these remote parts of nature, this was absolutely mad for the time. Nobody understood what this was about. Nobody saw nature in this way. This is why people like Steiner and people like Owen Barfield, who's one of the great sort of expositors of Steiner's work, they basically say that the nature that we experience today, what we understand as nature, was practically invented by the Romantics in the late 18th century. Because before that, people didn't go out of their way to go to mountains or go to the forest or go to these, wild places. They just stayed away from that. That was the wilderness. That was, where things weren't civilized. And so Goethe was one of the early ones who he found this terrific expansion of the soul by contemplating the natural world and all that. And so Goethe is a character who does that, but this woman he falls in love with, she rejects him, and in the end he basically sort of blows his brains out and all that. And this wave of romantic passion for love and for nature across Europe. But then Goethe, being who he was, he quickly outgrew this and sort of wrote himself out of it and became this more Olympian kind of classical kind of figure.
Now, I'm very interested in the concept of the Urpflanz that you mentioned before, because I know it had a deep impact on Steiner. And my understanding is that what Goethe was intending is that the archetypes that form the essence of his poetry are essentially identical to the archetypal or original forms that are the basis of nature.
Yes. I mean, Goethe said art is basically doing what nature does, but a little bit more. Truth for Goethe is this meeting place between sort of the laws of the inner world and the laws of the outer world. And when the two come together, this is when truth emerges for Goethe. And this was the kind of science he was trying to get across in an age when what was going on in the inner world was completely, rejected. In fact, you had to get rid of that because that was sort of, messing up this nice, neat, objective world out there that we can observe through a plate glass. And for Goethe, the whole idea was to observe with the same kind of passion, let's say, or the same kind of warmth. This is a word that Steiner carried over here, the warmth of the soul when you're observing something. And it will respond. What you're observing to will respond to that, and it will reveal its secrets to you. And there was a kind of inner harmony between what was out in the outer world and what was inside. And Goethe was trying to find that. And he found it in many different ways. There's a famous story when he was traveling and he was in Strasbourg, which was a city that's always sort of in between being either in France or in Germany for centuries. And the famous cathedral was still being built or was about to be finished. And again, Goethe was a man of many, many interests. And he studied this cathedral, which was up until, a century or so later, the tallest building in Europe. And he was studying it from all different sides and different perspectives and inside and out. And then later on, the conversation about it, he remarked that there must have been a change in the architect's original idea, the original design of the building. And this was not something that sort of everyone knew, but someone who he was conversing with knew this. And he said, how could you tell? How did you know that this was happening? And he said, well, the cathedral itself told me. And as he observed it with this kind of warmth and this kind of intensity or intention, he could see where it was going in a certain place up to one spot, and then it changed. And he could see where the original tension, it would have done something or other. I don't remember exactly what it was. But again, this was a way of putting himself inside what he was observing and harmonizing his own kind of inner being with its being, and the truth would come out between the two. And this is something that Steiner took and basically ran with it. Because what Goethe is talking about, this Urpflanze, or this other phenomena, which is, like you say, it's a kind of archetype. It's not a Jungian archetype. It's not a Platonic idea. It's somewhere. It inhabits the realm that Henri Corbin would later christen the imaginal. It's not the imaginary.
Yeah.
It's a reality that's in between the physical and the abstract. Well, and that we can enter into with our imagination.
It's a very important concept, worth people contemplating. But in addition to being a Goethe scholar, Steiner was one of the early scholars digging into the Nietzsche archives. I think even at a time, Nietzsche is now regarded as one of the great philosophers of the 19th century, early 20th century, but at the time he was relatively unknown, I think, when Steiner began exploring his ideas.
Well, I mean, Nietzsche went mad in the late 1880s, And from about 1889 on until about 1900 when he died, he was insane. He had basically more. It was from syphilis. This was what was the most recognized sort of theory. And sadly, he's one of these. Talk about the romantics. I mean, he's one of these tragic romantic figures that it wasn't only until after his death that his ideas started to become more widely known and accepted. While he was alive, one or two people knew about him, but he literally was the loneliest man in the world at the time. But by the time Steiner met him, and I say met because they said when he was introduced to Nietzsche, Nietzsche was completely out of his mind. It's about 1895. His ideas had started to disseminate out into the world, and he was getting this recognition that he should have had when he was sane. And it's sad that at the time Nietzsche was more or less in the care of his sister, who was out and out anti-Semite. I mean, it was the last person in the world who should have had control over Nietzsche's books and everything after his life, and that's a whole incredible story in the history of ideas. But what she would do is that she would wrap him in a toga and sort of place Nietzsche by the window, and he basically was just crazy, and he would just be gazing out,
I guess he was in a catatonic state,
more or less catatonic state, or he would he'd have fits and all this kind of thing. But she would bring important people in and introduce her famous brother, the philosopher, to them. So, but she basically headhunted Steiner because of his notoriety in doing the Goethe archives, and she wanted to do a similar Nietzsche archive as the Goethe archive, and so she basically approached him and asked him to come, and he came and he met Nietzsche, and he tells of this kind of psychic experience he has sitting next to Nietzsche and seeing the kind of vision of him in his soul state and all that kind of thing, which I tell you, I say in the book, if you're familiar with Nietzsche and what Steiner says, you would think Nietzsche would be sort of turning over in his grave, because it was very kind of a very, how should we say it, solemn way that Nietzsche wouldn't have appreciated. But Steiner himself had this remarkable facility. Again, it's his power to put himself into the other's place. And he wrote this fantastic book about Nietzsche, Nietzsche, Philosopher of Freedom, or Fighter for Freedom. Yeah. And even though he disagreed with Nietzsche's, in the long run, materialist view, because Nietzsche denied the reality of a spiritual world and all that kind of thing, he had good reasons for doing it within his philosophy. Can't go into that now. But Steiner could understand Nietzsche's the positive side, his obsession with freedom and free thought and casting off the old outmoded ideas and things of that sort. So even though he disagreed with him, he wrote a book that's an excellent introduction to his ideas. But in the long run, he didn't get the job of the Steiner archive because he realized that Elizabeth Forster Nietzsche, the Steiner archives, those were on their way, the Steiner archives. He didn't get the job of the Nietzsche archives because he, in the long run, had an argument with his sister, because he realized that she was she didn't know the first thing about Nietzsche's philosophy, and she realized she couldn't work with her. Mm-hmm.
Well, I gather that his book Nietzsche, Philosophy, a Philosopher of Freedom, was really Steiner's philosophy of freedom. Actually, it's the philosophical basis for all of his later work, and I gather that for him, freedom meant the freedom of the soul to explore realms that we now associate with clairvoyance and mysticism and the paranormal. That's where Steiner was heading, but it never became obvious until he developed an association with the Theosophists.
No, this was true. As I said, Steiner was lecturing in Berlin to Marxists. He was lecturing. I mean, what he was doing is he had his sort of basic, philosophy was his German idealism, and it's sort of, the reality of the soul, reality of the spirit, mind, consciousness is paramount, the material world is sort of secondary, and so on and so on. And this had fallen very much out of fashion. But he was, how should we say, he was kind of a gentle saboteur, because he was able, in the context of doing a lecture on Marx, and he knew Marx back and forth, just like he knew Kant and Hegel and Lessing and everybody else, and he would gently introduce kind of little inconsistencies or contradictions or something that would lead the audience to go to question some of the ideas. He wasn't, instead of, out and out kind of arguing against Marx and sort of, arguing for or a deistic vision. He would sort of lead the audience, as good teachers do, for them to question it and all that. And he wrote a book of his own called Philosophy of Freedom, which has come out in different translations at different times, the title. There was Philosophy of Spiritual Activity. And this is one in which Steiner was trying to establish that the I, das Ich, was an irreducible reality. You couldn't reduce the I to something else. And this was in opposition to all the materialist philosophy which still today is trying to reduce our sense of I to, something going on in the brain or on a molecular level or something like that. And Steiner came up with a very rigorous, and actually, how should we say it, activating philosophy. I mean, what I say in the book is the process of reading his book, The Philosophy of Freedom, it produces the very kind of state of the sense of an intense sense of your I that he's arguing for, because you become actively involved in the argument. And you become aware of your own inner world as an activity. And that was sort of the first thing he wanted to establish. He wanted to establish the inner world as a realm of free activity, free creative activity. It can't be reduced to other things like that. But then, as you say, he was invited to lecture to the Theosophists. And originally he had read A.P. Sennett's book, Esoteric Buddhism, which was the book that really got Madame Blavatsky across to lots of people. It was a real kind of, simplified version of Blavatsky's whole kind of thing. Madame Blavatsky is one of the founders of the Theosophical Society, late 19th century, probably the most important esoteric or
I would love to do a separate interview with you about her.
Oh, we could do that. Yeah. I've written a book on her too.
I know.
But Steiner was first turned off because he wasn't particularly interested in the Indian, the Eastern kind of thing. He was very much in the Western tradition. He wanted to, when he came out, as it were, as a spiritual teacher, what he wanted to do was do a Christian, Rosicrucian, kind of Gnostic, Hermetic, the whole Western kind of tradition. So he wasn't really interested in but although he did adopt it because he was there. Again, this is something that he was able to do. I mean, the early and great occult historian James Webb, who wrote in the 70s, he said that Steiner basically joined the Theosophical Society in order to take it over, because what he needed was a platform, and he increasingly saw himself as this kind of world teacher, and he wanted to. Here already you had a whole system, a whole platform, a whole network, and he was going to take it over. But he came into clashes with Annie Besant. But in his early books, he does use a lot of theosophical language. You can tell. But then there's a change in about 1912 or something like that. He's kind of moves away from a lot of that.
Well, when you talked about reading his book on the philosophy of freedom and how the book itself seemed to enable you to enter into the state of consciousness that Steiner was describing, I recall in my youth, I was exposed to Steiner at about the age of 21, and it had a big impact on me at that time. And I started by reading one of his classic books, Knowledge of Higher Worlds and Its Attainment. And I remember now in that book, he actually said, just reading the book is going to change you.
That's true. Well, I think what he's trying to do fundamentally is get you to feel your I, your inner world as an activity, as something you do rather than something you have. It's to get away from the passive, because that's and then that's the next step. I mean, he's arguing against the Cartesian idea that consciousness is a reflection of the world outside, or against John Locke's contention that there's nothing in the mind that didn't get there first through the senses.
Yeah.
So I'm saying we're born, our heads are sort of like empty apartments, and we have to go to IKEA and buy a bunch of stuff and bring it. Oh, now we got a nice flat or something like that. And Steiner's saying, no, it's actually furnished already. And it's furnished with the phenomena, is furnished with the archetypes, it's furnished with these spiritual realities that we come into the world. And that's what he generally starts to move towards,
I recall being very moved when he described every single thought as a spiritual entity.
Exactly. I said it's remarkable because one of the earliest, along with this vision he had of the women walking into the station and then seeing the nature spirits out in the mountains and woods. Mathematics had an incredible impression on him, much like Bertrand Russell, but the response was very different. I mean, Bertrand Russell was very young. I don't know how old he was, and he read through Euclid, all that, when he was 5 or 6 or something. But Steiner also came upon mathematics, and what it meant for him was that, this basically you're saying, the experiencing I'm having about having this inner world, perceiving these inner realities, this is about that. And in the sense that mathematical realities are something that we can perceive without having any contact with the outer world. You can understand what a triangle is without having to have an actual triangle. And any actual triangle that you will encounter in the world, and any triangle that you and I might be thinking of now, for Steiner, it's the same triangle. This is a kind of Platonic reality that through mathematics he felt. So this was a spiritual reality, and he does talk for us in a rather overblown sometimes or kind of purple language, but he does talk about the inner world was not just a place where thoughts just kind of came up. It was sort of this kind of inner landscape where spiritual soul beings could emerge. And he was numbers for him were like that. And thoughts were, like you say, thoughts were like flowers and trees and things growing, inside.
And of course, he seems to be squarely, from your description, in the Pythagorean and Platonic tradition here.
Oh, yeah. I mean, very much. He's very much in the Western tradition. I mean, he'll later give lectures on how people like Pythagoras and Plato, how their place in the tradition from his point of view of this kind of spiritual history. Because he takes over from Theosophy the idea that, there were, not only were there different civilizations before ours, Atlantis and Lemuria, the Earth itself was in a different kind of incarnation, and the cosmos was in a different incarnation. And the evolution of consciousness and the evolution of the cosmos are the same sort of thing. They're not two separate. We are not evolving inside the cosmos. The cosmos and us are evolving. We're both the same kind of thing. And so he puts this, tradition of this knowledge back to earlier kinds of states of mind and consciousness. And these sort of, unfortunate language, he talks about old moon consciousness and old sun consciousness. But then he's trying to relate these early states of consciousness to the Hermetic tradition, which uses kind of the planets as a kind of scale. This is kind of a motif that runs through all of the sort of Western tradition, whether it's Steiner, whether it's Gurdjieff's ray of creation. You have it in Theosophy as well. So this is kind of a fundamental kind of archetype, this kind of travel back up the planets kind of thing. And Steiner sees that and uses that as a way to talk about these different states of consciousness.
Now, he was the head of the German branch of the Theosophical Society, I think, for about a decade. And then eventually he created a separate movement called Anthroposophy.
Yes. That came, that was gradually developing, but it came to a head with Krishnamurti, when Annie Besant and Charles Leadbeater discovered this young boy Krishnamurti on the banks of the river and all that, and they were promoting him as the avatar of the New Age and this kind of thing. And Steiner, because of his very Christian kind of grounding, he couldn't accept. And he was also aware of certain dubious reports about Leadbeater's interest in young boys, which we wouldn't go into, but that turned into a whole legal scandal around Krishnamurti there. And so this was a break, and there was a kind of feud between Steiner and Annie Besant going on for a while, and they were each excommunicating each other, which sadly happens. But then he broke off, taking practically all of his German followers, and then people from Theosophical Societies in other sort of surrounding countries. And he started what he called the Anthroposophical Society, as you say, Anthroposophy. Theosophy is the wisdom of the gods, and Anthroposophy is the wisdom of man, or of the human, we would say today. And again, it is a very human-centered, and this comes from the Christocentrism of it, as we would say. And Steiner had his own peculiar esoteric ideas about Christianity. I mean, just like people like Blake and others have. And but he did see the incarnation of Christ as kind of like the central event in human history so far, because for him it marked the lowest descent of spirit into matter, and that spirit starts to move back up towards the higher realms, and again in this kind of travel back up the planets sort of motif.
Well, the interesting thing to me is that with the founding of the Anthroposophical Society, Steiner's work evolved to being more than just philosophy. He became an incredible creator in architecture and dance, movement, painting, medicine, education. His followers regard him as the embodiment of the ideal of the Nietzschean Superman, and I think you can make a very good case for that.
Well, I mean, one of the things that set him apart immediately from the rest of the Theosophical Society was this interest in art and culture and all this kind of thing. And even while he was still in it, there was a conference in Paris. I can't forget the exact I don't remember the exact year. But he had met a Frenchman named Edouard Chouret, who in the early 20th century, late 19th century, had a big bestseller called The Great Initiates. Yes. And it was a big popular book about the idea that it's ancient wisdom is handed down from sage to sage. So it's Pythagoras gives it to somebody, he gives it to Plato, Plato gives it to somebody else, and so on and so on. And it talks about Krishna and Isis and a variety of other mythological figures are in there. And he was completely impressed by Steiner. And he was a dramatist as well. And this is how Steiner met his second wife, Marie von Sievers, who was a friend of Chouret's, and she was a Baltic Russian who was an actress in the old school, the old sort of declamatory school of acting. And they put together this performance for the conference, and they also decorated the hall and all this wonderful, painting and color and light and all this sort of thing. And the Theosophists weren't really used to that kind of thing. It was a bit more sort of sober, even for all the kind of wildness around Madame Blavatsky, who was long gone by now. And this was something that set them apart already. And Steiner just kind of went for it. And when he finally broke, one of the things he did was build a center for the new movement. It was sort of a temple for the new religion that he was creating. And I make no mistake, I think Steiner felt the need for, and he decided he was going to try to create a new religion for the modern age. And this was something that he called the Goethe Annum, which was in honor of Goethe. And he originally was going to build it in Munich, but then something came up, and there was actually a large anti-Steiner. There always was kind of a large anti-Steiner contingent around, people that were always trying to prevent him. They saw him as a threat, various different groups. So something happened and he couldn't do it in Munich, but then he was given land in Switzerland near a place called Dornach. And there he built the Goethe Annum, and it was one of the most incredible things. This is how I first became interested in Steiner, to tell you the truth. I mean, I'd seen his name in different books I read, but I was a great fan of expressionist art, German expressionism. And there was a very small school of expressionist architects who didn't build a great deal. They made lots of plans, but they didn't build many things. One of the few things they built was something called the Einstein Tower that's outside of Berlin in Potsdam. But Steiner built this thing, and it was huge, and it had a bigger dome than St. Peter's in Rome. It's enormous. It's gigantic. It was like, you think of Hagia Sophia in Istanbul. It was like that. And it was made of wood that violins were made of. And there were no straight lines. And everything had this fantastic Art Nouveau, organic kind of flowing shapes, and the shapes weren't repeated. And the window was all, stained glass window. And he had artists, and he was building it at the same time as World War I was starting
and to be clear, he designed this.
He designed it. He top to bottom. He designed it, everything in it, and all that. Helped make it. Helped carve the wood. Painted the stained glass. Gave directions to everything on that. And this is all through his. He had all these ideas about how the shape would draw down the cosmic energies, and people entering into it would feel, just by entering into the building, they would feel something different. And all that. And in fact, when he first, in many ways, it backfired, because when he did bring people in, it was so strange to them that many of them didn't know what to make of it. And when I saw photographs of this thing, I thought, God, who made this? Who designed this? Because it was something out of some fantasy kind of, romantic, weird kind of novel. And suddenly it's for real. I mean, sadly, it burned down, and there's a whole story around that.
Well, my sense is that through his clairvoyant vision, he had a notion of what the Theosophists were calling etheric energies and astral energies, and that his idea was that the architecture itself, as well as his form of movement called eurythmy and the style of painting that he developed, and all of these endeavors were designed to sort of bring these etheric energies into the earthly plane where they could be used productively by humans.
Yeah. Also to sort of stimulate a perception of the supersensible. Mm-hmm. And again, it didn't stay entirely in-house. People like Vasily Kandinsky, one of the great originators of modern abstract art, he was a student of Steiner's. Other Pierre Mondrian, other famous early abstract modern painters were influenced by these ideas. But yeah, exactly that. And by contemplating these color was very, very important for Steiner, because color was something. He in a way you can say he sort of developed a kind of technique of inducing synesthesia, which is where the senses blend over. Mm-hmm. So color and sound come together.
And he was very inspired by Goethe's work on color.
Again, Goethe wrote, Goethe had a whole book, his Farbenlehre, theory of color. Again, this is where Goethe took arms against Newton. And this is, again, what people are saying, poor Goethe, what is he doing? He's saying Newton's wrong?
But Steiner sided with Goethe in that
absolutely,
debate.
yeah. And strangely enough, Ludwig Wittgenstein, one of the great philosophers of the 20th century, he said in many ways Steiner was doing something. It's not that Newton was wrong; it's that Goethe was doing something different than what Newton was doing. Mm-hmm. And what Goethe was trying to do, he was trying to pin down our experience of the color. Mm-hmm. Newton was saying, "Oh, this is how color is made. Yeah. This is what it's like. Material. It's all the white light broken up." And for Goethe, that's not real, because you're torturing the light in order to produce that effect. We don't do that in real life. Mm-hmm. In our life, we don't do that. This is how we are. This is how color is for us in our life. So he was an early, what we would call a phenomenologist. Mm-hmm. He was trying to study the phenomena experiencing the color, not trying to come up with a reason for it or explain it away in terms of something. And Steiner took that, where Goethe, in many ways, Goethe sort of stopped there. He was happy with this is the world around me. This is nature around me. I'm not looking for anything behind it. Mm-hmm. I'm not looking for any deeper. He was spiritual, but he wasn't spiritual in his looking. He was like, it's all here. Goethe said, nature has neither kernel nor shell. It's both. Everything is always there at all times. There's nothing hidden. And Steiner kind of just took it and went further with it. Mm-hmm. Went deeper and starts using these experiences as platforms to start to describe and enter into these spiritual worlds. Because if you practice the kind of exercises that he talks about in the book you mentioned earlier, Knowledge of the Higher Worlds, one of the first things that comes across is this experience of color in your dreams. You start to have dreams with stronger experiences of color, and this is supposed to be an indication that your consciousness is entering into the higher realms and all that.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of my senses of why Steiner was so extremely creative in this period is that he had a community, a large community around him, so he could work with medical people, he could work with economists, he could work with politicians, he could work with educators and farmers, and they would come to him for essentially philosophical insights, and he provided it to them, and they would run with it and develop industries.
Oh, this is true. I mean, Steiner was one of the most practical or practically successful in a practical way of the great esoteric teachers of the 20th century, I would say. I mean, one of the first things he did in that realm were the schools, we call them Steiner schools. It's Waldorf education. I just was in Stuttgart on my way somewhere else to give at a conference. And Stuttgart was where the first Steiner school came up at the Waldorf Astoria Tobacco Company. And Steiner had people involved in there. The owners of the company put up the money to start the school. And Steiner had a whole technique and methodology of education. And during his lifetime, he was known as an educationalist.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, as well as being known as a spiritual teacher. But there's in the early 20s, he was in Manchester, here up in the north, and along, I don't remember the names, but along with other well-known educationalists at the time. And there was nothing said about his esoteric or occult ideas. They were all talking about him as educational ideas. He was up there with Montessori and all that kind of thing. So that was one of the first things he did. And then after that, it started to take on a very practical kind of life. And that was one of the results of World War I. Because after World War I was saying, Steiner, the Goethe Annum was built by people from all of the combating countries. Yeah. So you had English, you had Germans, you had Russians, you had Austrians, you had everybody there working. So it was supposed to this unified symbol. But after the war, Steiner actually he was an important political figure for a while, because he wrote a book called The Threefold Commonwealth, which was a kind of reconstruction plan for post-war Europe, and it became a bestseller on the continent in German-speaking countries. And he was lecturing on it around German-speaking countries, but he also had anthroposophists were getting on to local, election platforms to try, like the Green Party today or something like that, doing that there. And he again, this started to get political opposition to him. Marxists were coming, proto-Aryan, proto-Nazi groups coming back after World War I, feeling they got stabbed in the back and all that kind of thing. And that's a whole other story too. Steiner was accused of being responsible for Germany's loss of the war because he gave the general in charge the wrong advice or something like that. It's all wrong. It's all mixed up. But again, this was something that people had against him at the time. And in many ways, it seemed like whenever he started to get a bit outside of the niche where he was into the real world, forces came up to kind of block him in some ways. And there was assassination attempts on him later on and all that. But, from the political, the educational, then with architectural, painting, one of the last things in that sense was the biodynamic farming, was the agricultural ideas he had. And today that's huge, that's big, and this is well ahead of what we call organic farming and all that sort of thing today. And it's just remarkable how many of the things that they're still around, and that's one of the reasons why I wrote the book, is that my children were going to a Steiner school. Their mother was very interested in it, and I kept talking to parents I met at it, and they didn't really know much about him. And then they also thought, as I said, when they looked at the books about him, they all seemed a bit like, well, you kind of have to join the cult, kind of, to like, and they just were interested because they thought the schools were better than the state schools and all that. Yeah. And I realized there are a lot of people out there that are sort of, they're in touch with Steiner's things through the schools or something else, but they don't have a general idea what he's about. And so that's why I wrote the book, was to do that, because you can know him in all these different ways. And I think these days, a lot of how should we say it? There's a sense in which they want to kind of keep the more occult kind of Steiner a little bit quiet, because it's a little weird compared to all the very good things we're doing, in the practical world. We're having a lot of success in this practical kinds of things. So later on, I had some brushes with the sort of Steiner education people here too, and it was a little, they weren't too happy with how I presented him in some ways. But in any case, that's water under the bridge.
Well, one of the concepts that seems central to his thinking and to the mystery plays that he wrote that are currently being performed at the new Goetheanum, after the wooden structure was burned down, they rebuilt another magnificent structure.
Made of concrete.
Yeah. In fact, one of the first poured concrete buildings ever.
Absolutely, yeah.
It looks very modern now. I imagine it was rather shocking to people when it first was designed. I understand it has one of the largest theaters in all of Europe, maybe outside of Moscow. Oh. And but he performs mystery plays there, and as I understand them, they are centered on the concept of initiation, spiritual initiation, which was very important to his thinking.
Yeah, well, yeah, Steiner, yeah, he did think in terms of initiation. I mean, early in his career, he actually briefly was a member of an organization called the OTO, the Ordo Templi Orientis, which is generally associated with Aleister Crowley, and you wouldn't think Steiner and Crowley had too much in common. But it was basically a Masonic organization, and Steiner felt the need for a kind of ritual. He felt the need for something like that. He was very religious when he was a young boy. He took part in the Mass and all that. He grew up Catholic, even though he was accused of being Jewish by different groups at different times. But he was a good Catholic, and he was sort of an altar boy and all that kind of thing. So he had a personal like and a respect for ritual and all that kind of thing. And the mystery plays, where they're supposed to induce that kind of sense of awe, mystery, holy terror to some degree. I don't know how successful they are. I mean, again, this is one aspect where it can come across as a bit solemn. It can come across as a bit sort of like Sunday schoolish. As a very, it's this, I think, sadly was the influence of his second wife, Marie von Sievers, because she came from an old school of acting. I mean, the time when Steiner was editing literary magazines and things of that sort, this was like the people like Strindberg and Ibsen, Bernard Shaw, others like that, where it was much more modern. It was much more about modern events, and much more people could relate to it rather than this more theatrical kind of thing. But Marie von Sievers was more in that school, and I think Steiner influenced by that. But I would imagine being performed in the Goethe Anum, and they generally have, Bruckner or Beethoven or some, tremendous classical music in the background. I would think it would be, have that kind of effect that he would want to have, just like the building itself should have an effect on you. I would think that performance would do that. But there were certain stages of initiation Steiner had, and having to do with different sort of modes of consciousness that we can develop. And sort of imagination, intuition, and inspiration, I think, was sort of that. I think that's the kind of the sequence. And he follows that pattern in a variety of different exercises that he talks about in books like Knowledge of the Higher Worlds and others like that. But art was supposed to be one of the ways to initially get it going, to get the imagination going.
He refers to an experience that he calls the encounter with the guardian of the threshold, which is like this very fierce being. I've always assumed that this guardian of the threshold is like your own Jungian shadow that you have to confront.
Yes, it is something. It's sort of the accumulated, unresolved karma of some way that confronts you on the path. And he actually got the idea from a novel by a 19th century English writer named Bulwer Lytton. Who wrote The Last Days of Pompeii. And he wrote a fantastic esoteric novel called Zanoni, which is about Rosicrucianism. But he's also best known for writing the worst opening line of a book. It was a dark and stormy night. Yeah. So he's one of these 19th century kind of overwritten writers. But in Zanoni, there is this encounter with I think they call it the dweller on the threshold in the book, and it's on the Rosicrucian path. You encounter your darkness, you encounter, all of that part of yourself that you've not, yet resolved, or you've not yet refined, and all this kind of thing. And this is something very much like the Jungian shadow. And this is something that you had to meet on the way. And unless you pass that, and I get in various other traditions, it's like that. It's all of the darkness, all the parts of ourselves that we are either unaware of or are aware of, but refuse to acknowledge in any kind of real way. And this is something very powerful. And Blavatsky talks about it as well. And I think in different ways, Bulwer Lytton's contribution to this isn't as well known as it should be. Because he himself was actually a very serious psychic investigator. You probably know, like his early book, The House, The Haunted and the Haunter. It's fictional, but it's in many ways based on an account of something he actually went through, going to a haunted house and he was sort of like an early X-Files person, one of the earliest kind of scientific investigators of this sort of thing.
Yeah. Now, Steiner, as I recall, died in 1925, which would mean there are probably very few, if any, people alive today who actually knew him. When I was a young man and first encountered anthroposophy, I actually met people who had known Steiner, but they've passed on at this point. And it strikes me, from our contemporary perspective, that while Steiner was an enormously important person in the history of Western esotericism, there's a sense in which the movement he founded has become a bit crystallized at the time of his death. I don't get the sense that there's an ongoing evolution within the anthroposophical community.
Well, I think that's something that's true of quite a few of what we might call old school spiritual teachings or esoteric teachings. At least it's something I've come across here in London, because I've written a book on Steiner, written a book on Swedenborg, I've written a book on Ouspensky, from the Gurdjieff Ouspensky work, and others. And the general average age of people coming to these things is tending to be in the 60s and 70s. I just was at a conference in Germany. It was a different group. It was a Rosicrucian group, but most of the people there were around that sort of age. And I think, there's a certain, I think this is one of the things that happens in the esoteric world, is that you have the leader and then you have people come after, and they're often more royal than the king, if you know what I mean. They often feel like, they have to somehow codify and make solid, just say in the same way that the second Goethe Annum was concrete, and here it is, and it's not moving, and a tank isn't going to get through this thing, sort of very, very similarly. But I found more recently that these places are trying to open up. I know there's Rudolf Steiner House here in London. Again, it's designed anthroposophically. It's not as big as the Goethe Annum, but you can see once you're inside, and you can see on the outside all of these motifs. And they've been reaching out to get new people in. And the same is true with this Swedenborg Society. They have a lovely building in Bloomsbury part of London, an old Georgian building, and they've been opening up the space to new sorts of ththings. So I think people are reaching out, but it's kind of difficult these days, because I think there's a lot of competition and there's a lot of other things out there. But I did want to say, I actually did meet one person who met Steiner, and this was Owen Barfield, and I mentioned him earlier, and he's not that well known, but he was one of the Inklings. He was also a friend of C.S. Lewis and a friend of J.R.R. Tolkien, and they were a group of writers and poets who met in a pub in Oxford in the 40s and talked about poetry and mythology and all this sort of thing. But Barfield met Steiner very briefly, and Steiner came to London for a talk once I think the year he died or just before he died. And and I interviewed Owen Barfield in 1997, and this was the year before he died. And I think he was 104. Oh, no, I'm sorry. No, he wasn't. He just turned 100. I'm thinking of something else. He just turned 100. So he, he would have had to have been that old for, him to, me to have met him at this late age. And so that was one of the, interesting things to have met somebody from that time. But, it is true. I think it's difficult. But one of the things I do when I give these talks at these different places, I also say, well, the Steinerites, you should talk to the Swedenborgians, and the Swedenborgians, you should talk to the Jungians, and all three of you should talk to the Gurdjieffians, and talk to some of these other people too. And instead of, kind of holding your own, protecting your little patch, come together and find where you have things share, because that's the only way any of these ideas are going to get across into the broader culture in any kind of real serious way.
It's all happening inside of your mind.
Well, absolutely. I'm trying to do that. I'm trying to show, well, this is like that. And okay, does it? And again, you don't have to buy to get something out of Steiner. You don't have to buy everything.
Yeah.
It's like you can pick and choose. I mean, people have said, well, you basically, you focus on his early, I focus a lot on the Goethe period, because I think in many ways philosophically, and that's my interest.
Well, Gary, I think you and I have one thing in common, which is this sensibility that we are the inheritors of all of the world's esoteric traditions. And I think we have a responsibility to make an effort to digest them and to pass on that synthesis.
Absolutely. And also to bring it into the mainstream conversation. I mean, Goethe influenced Steiner. Well, Goethe is part of the mainstream, conversation. And we all know people like William James and Henri Bergson from the early 20th century or late 19th century. These are famous Nobel Prize winners. William James, famous American philosopher and psychologist. He was deeply interested in all this sort of stuff, mysticism. And he wasn't afraid to talk about it out in the open and all that kind of thing. Now, if you mention it, you lose your tenure at some kind of academy or something.
That's very unfortunate, but I know Steiner still is influential. Saul Bellow, for example.
Absolutely.
The great novelist was very devoted to Steiner.
Yeah, he was. In fact, Bellow engaged in a kind of correspondence course in Steiner with Owen Barfield. And I think it was Humboldt's Gift, the novel is, where he talks about practicing some of the Steiner exercises and things of that sort. And he was also interested in Schwala de Lubitsch. Saul Bellow. He wrote an introduction to a biography of de Lubitsch. So again, these ideas, they're there, but I think it is important to find the kind of, minimum working hypothesis, let's say, that they all kind of share, that, we can all come away from. So, I mean, there's a great deal of Steiner, like the Christocentrism of Steiner stuff. It doesn't bother me one way or the other, but I don't feel you really have to accept that in order to understand what he means about imaginative perception or, imagination as a form of knowledge. You can get that without having to accept. And you don't have to accept all the stuff about Lemuria, Atlantis, and all that kind of stuff either. It's fun to read, but it doesn't have to be exactly like that.
Well, it's very interesting, Steiner's theology, where he puts together a trinity of Christ, Lucifer, and the Persian deity Ahriman.
Yeah, I mean, he sees. In general, he kind of sees a polarity at work between Lucifer and Ahriman, and you can say Lucifer is kind of overweening pride and the sense of I could do it alone, and Trump is very Luciferic, we could say, very self-confident kind of thing, and Ahriman is very heavy. It's materialist. It's kind of dull. It's basically keeping everything in kind of conformity. And between the two, it's a figure that Steiner calls the representative of humanity, which is Christ. And it's supposed to be the unification of these two polarities, and they work in different ways. And again, that whole motif is across the board in Steiner's ideas. You see it a lot in the anthroposophical medicine, the difference between sort of inflammation and sclerosis. There's either you're too hot or you're too cold and hard, and it's kind of, and you can see that in Indian rajas and tattvas and all that kind of stuff as well. So it puts it together. But yeah, this is a fundamental kind of polarity. And Steiner saw, he had a vision of the coming age, the coming century, and it's almost 100 years now since he died. Not quite, but almost. That the West, something was going to happen between the West and Russia. So there was some. Russia was supposed to be able to somehow come up with this third way that was going to. Actually, between the West and the East. And you have the West and and then the East, and Russia was supposed to somehow be some way to unify these kinds of things. And he was very influential in Russia. And there's a famous lecture he gave. It wasn't in Russia; it was in Paris in about 1906. But the creme de la creme of the Russian intelligentsia were at this lecture. And anthroposophy was very, very influential, even up into the revolution, and even after the revolution for a couple years. There were anthroposophical groups trying to work with the Bolsheviks and the early Soviets and all this kind of thing. But Steiner had high hopes for something new to emerge out of Russia in the early 20th century to somehow find a middle way between the East and the West. And then it was cut short by the Bolsheviks coming in. Yeah. And he thought there was a Russian philosopher named Vladimir Soloviev who was very influential. Dostoevsky was a friend of his. And he had this whole idea, this integral kind of philosophy, bringing together, both, what we were talking about. And oddly enough, he is on Vladimir Putin's reading list these days. Oh. A few years ago, Vladimir Putin gave out to his regional governors a list of books they should read, and one of them was a book called The Justification of the Good by Soloviev, and it's this. It's like that. It's a doorstopper, and in it, he articulates very clearly this whole philosophy of integration of these two kind of opposites and all that. So I find it kind of interesting that about 100 years later, from when all that attempt to, present this new way was cut short by the Bolsheviks, it's coming up a bit now.
Well, I think it's important to realize that Steiner's concept you referred to earlier of the threefold social order nearly became the blueprint for the German government. Instead, they adopted the Weimar Republic.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. No, I mean, these ideas go back to Plato. I mean, the threefold sort of idea goes back to sort of Platonic, the Republic and all that sort of thing. So, again, if you go back and you look at what was happening just after the war in Europe, Steiner was incredibly popular. That idea could have got picked up. I mean, I'd say in the book there were some lectures where the queue or the line went out the door and around the block and all that, and traffic was stopped and all that kind of thing. So he was the man of the hour for a while.
So for people who are interested in the integration of a mystical or idealistic perspective with the practical affairs of the world, it is very worthwhile to study Steiner.
Absolutely. And his influence goes on even today. As I say, there's many biodynamic farms in Europe, in England, the schools. They've come into a little bit of friction here lately with the health and safety kind of mania, but I think they're still going strong.
I believe the Waldorf school system is the second largest private school system in the world.
Yes, it is. It's enormous. I mean, and it's produced quite a lot of good people that go back out into the world and actually try to, it goes back in some ways to Plato's ideas in the sense that education should be about producing a good, rounded person who could go out and take an active role in the society they live in, And I think that's something that the Steiner schools aim at.
I was very struck when I was a young man in my early 20s. I encountered the Anthroposophical Society in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And there I met a young woman who had gone through the Waldorf schools her whole life. And I was really struck because she was physically, I would have described her as very unattractive, but there was something about, I would call it her etheric energy, which made her extremely attractive to me.
Well, she probably had, something going there. Her astral body. sending out the right signals. Yeah.
Something about the Waldorf education.
Yeah. Well, I think it's about unifying. It's also about, one of the strange things they do, strange by normal standards, that they don't teach reading until the age of 7.
Yeah.
And this for Steiner has something to do with the second set of teeth coming in.
Yeah.
And actually, I recently saw some neurological reason for that, and I should have noted it down. I don't remember it now, but there was something about reading and the teeth that there is some neurological connection, and I don't see how Steiner could have known this. It's something he must have just known from experience, because he was a tutor for many years.
Yes,
and he tells a story where he cured a boy who was mentally retarded. He was hydrocephalic. He was someone who had water on the brain. He was couldn't read, couldn't write, couldn't do anything. And not only did he educate this boy, but he went on to sort of become, I think he took on a sort of very important role in the social service or something like that.
He became a medical doctor, as I recall.
Exactly. Okay, a doctor. I forgot. So Steiner is incredible. Patience is one of the key word for Steiner. He was infinitely patient, infinitely solicitous, and I think this is what killed him in the end. He couldn't say no to people. So, and everybody would come up to him and ask him, should I do this? Should I do that? What about this? What about that? And he wasn't able to say no. And I think after a while, they took, little bits from him, and there wasn't anything left. But he had infinite amount of patience. And again, in that book, Knowledge of the Higher Worlds, and one of the simplest things he does is sort of to say, develop a sense of reverence, develop a sense of, of appreciation of things. And so, that kind of thing. You can see that he did that, and, there's something saintly about him almost. There's a interesting book by the psychologist Anthony Storr. It came out about 20 years ago, called Feet of Clay. That was what it was called here. I don't know what it was called in the States, but it was the study of gurus.
Yeah.
And he had lots good to say about Steiner. At the same time, he recognized that, as I'd say in the book, it's hard to kind of pin down somebody who has a very cogent criticism of Kant on one page, and next page he's talking about Lemuria or Atlantis. And it's well, that makes an incredible amount of sense, but I don't quite know what to make of this. And Storr was sort of stymied by that as well, but he said, but I can find nothing bad to say about this man. This man was just an infinite, gentle character who did nothing but give.
Well, I've had the same impression of Steiner, and I regard him as one of the most influential people in my own evolution. Well, Gary, thank you so much for sharing all of this. This has been so stimulating and delightful. I look forward to many more conversations like this with you.
Oh, well, thank you, Jeffrey, having me on. It's been wonderful. And yes, let's do it again. I'm looking forward to it.
Okay. Great to be with you.
Book 3 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
You can now download a free PDF copy of issue 7 of the New Thinking Aloud magazine, or order a beautiful printed copy.